Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another great PKF night. Tonight, we are very blessed to have Dr. Margaret and Father George, who will be discussing this topic of mental health. I'm sure it's something that everyone here, the us all being that working youth and above, have probably grappled with at one stage in our lives. At various degrees, right? So definitely a very interesting and engaging topic. It will be more so like a panel. Sam Caldas will be moderating, so he'll be asking the questions. But I believe there'll also be a Slido slash microphone that'll be going around. So if anyone has their own questions, please feel free to put them forward. So otherwise, let's get started, right? So Sam, Dr. Margaret, and Father George, if you could please come to the front.
Okay. Uh, Welcome everyone. Thanks, Philo. We'll jump right into it. So I'll just let our guests introduce themselves, and then we can. Why don't you start, brother? Then we can jump in.
Father George Liangas, priest of St. Nectarios Greek Orthodox Church in Burwood and child and adolescent psychiatrist.
I'm Margaret Tadros. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in private practice, and I'm also the Director of Counselling and a lecturer at St. Cyril's Coptic Orthodox Theological College.
So this conversation is a continuation, a sort of sequel to one that we had back during the COVID times. About 5 years ago, I think now, something thereabouts. Um, when it was sort of just at the beginning, I suppose, of this sort of renewed interest among Orthodox, Eastern and Oriental Orthodox people in the relationship between Orthodoxy and mental health. And a lot has happened since then. Um, and so felt it was time for a follow-up. And also, St. Cyril's wanted to hold an event like this, and there's a few more coming up, to sort of celebrate the launch of the counseling degree, which Margaret will talk about a little bit more as the night progresses. But the general theme, of course, is just mental health and orthodoxy, and the panelists will take whatever questions you have in that general theme. To start us off, though, Father George suggested that we discuss the theme of resilience. So the way that we'll run the night is we'll spend about, I don't know, 25 minutes at the beginning just to sort of start the conversation off with the theme of resilience. And then we'll open up to your questions either about that theme or about whatever other things that may occur to you. So let me start with just the question of how you would define resilience.
Thank you. I guess one way of putting resilience is to say the inner strength to be able to overcome adversity, or rather, doesn't mean that that we don't experience adversity or we don't feel the pain of the adversity, but the ability to manage the stress, the ability to bounce back, the ability to function even through the adversity, and to even grow through adversity. I guess that's one way of.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think you made every single point that I was going to make. So when we think about resilience, we think about the sorts of stresses that we would want to be resilient to, and they could be sort of everyday normal stresses that we all go through, right across to the other end of the spectrum where we might be talking about very significant, very challenging, maybe even traumatic experiences. But that's on one hand, and on the other hand, as Father George just said, thinking about how we adapt and cope to those experiences, how we respond, and even maybe even grow and learn from those experiences.
So, a quick, easy follow-up question from that is, what the definitions that you both gave there seem like they would be at home in a sort of secular psychological conversation. Does having an orthodox perspective on resilience bring anything different to, or how does it inform your understanding of resilience?
Having resilience is multifactorial. Some people might be naturally better at managing adversity than others, have sort of an inner strength that to some extent might be genetic, but to a large extent environmental. There are various theories amongst the psychological literature about what sort of leads to resilience. So some of the things, having protective factors, things that we're good at, or things, sort of inner resources that we have. Those things can be positive relationships, links in with other theories that lead to resilience, such as attachment theory. There is the stress inoculation theory. So, for example, being able to manage a lesser stress then allows you to be able to manage a greater stress, which means that there's danger of coddling a child, for example, and not allowing them to experience stress and not able to experience being able to get through to manage stress. And there's sort of many other theories. When we talk about mental health and we talk about particular symptoms, we might talk about the precipitating factor or a perpetuating factor, and other things are things that might trigger something off or might keep it going and whatever. But we also talk about the protective factors, and the resilience factors have a big overlap with the protective factors and resilience factors. So, the psychologist, what they try, or any therapist, the doctor, the GP, the psychiatrist, psychologist, any therapist, will try to not just treat symptoms, but will also be trying to build resilience, and so forth. So, from a secular point of view, building resilience is a very important part of treatment. And of course, our faith can add certain layers to the resilience for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because our faith, recognizing that there is an omniscient and omnipotent God who's going to look after those people that turn to Him. The hope that we have in our Lord certainly gives us the strength. And of course, the faith is not just a faith that is an abstract thing, is that God is there with those people to protect them and to guide them. We look at the martyrs and how they're able to sort of manage their martyrdom. It wasn't certainly just their own inner well-being. It was sort of the actual power of God sort of protecting them. So to know that we have a God, to know that is sort of one of those things where our faith can certainly help to build resilience. There's other factors as well. Margaret, I don't want to steal your thunder, so...
No, not at all. You could keep going. I think this, this question that is often asked is whether people are just born resilient. I think you touched on that, Father, just now, or whether resilience is something that's learned. I think certainly there are genetic factors that mean that we may have a disposition to responding to stress in a particular way. But I think the research is also pretty clear about the fact that that environmental factors are really important. So the sort of environment that we grow up in as children can make a huge difference in terms of impacting on whether we build the skills and have the attitude that is required to be able to deal with obstacles and challenges when they come our way. Now, having said that, even if you don't feel that you had an optimal environment for learning that as a child, that doesn't mean that you can't learn it as an adult. They are the sorts of things that we work on with people in therapy when they come and are struggling and are having difficulties dealing with whatever's happening to them. So I think, there's a lot of hope there that even if you don't feel resilient, that it's something that you could learn. And I think, there's an interesting intersection between that and faith, in that we know, for example, in the trauma literature, there is evidence that spirituality can be a protective factor in how people respond to traumatic events. And, I think my take on that, or my understanding of the way that might work, is that we know that that the way that people respond to trauma has a lot to do with the narrative that they build around that traumatic event. So in other words, if people can make sense of that event, if they can put it within a bigger context of their life story, and if it feels manageable, if the consequences of that event feel manageable, then they're much more likely to be able to respond resiliently. So to me, I think our faith provides us with all of those things. It helps us to make meaning of what has happened to us, especially if we can think about what's happened to us from the context of the bigger picture of God's plan for our life, which we might not always understand as we're going through it, but which can sometimes make more sense in retrospect than when we're going through that particular challenge. It helps us, our faith helps us to, as Father George said, to cope with the challenge that we're facing. We're encouraged, our Lord encourages us to go to Him and give Him our burden. He promises to give us rest. And so I think it's an interesting sort of intersection between what we know from the scientific literature and what we know our faith gives us. The two together, I think, make a lot of sense.
There is a beautiful quote from St. Paul that I think captures the whole concept of resilience in faith. And that is from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says, suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. In other words, suffering or affliction is not in vain. A lot of trauma symptoms is when you feel helpless. And one of the things about our faith is to recognize that indeed we're not helpless because we have Christ. St. Paul is saying that affliction has a positive aspect to it. Now, anyone familiar with the spiritual life, and I'm sure all of us are to some extent, we know that there is that the spiritual life is about being able to manage affliction, being able to we even impose affliction. For example, fasting, long services, and so forth. They're there to it's what we call asceticism, and we know that this asceticism helps to purify us. It helps us to grow in virtue. So suffering produces endurance. The Greek word is hypomone, which can also be translated as patience, perseverance, and that produces character. Character is sort of the inner strength, that resilience that we talked about. And character produces hope. Now, hope is not just an abstract sort of wish, but it's also that sort of belief in God that He will in the end look after us and to be there for us and to save us. And indeed, the most important thing in our lives is not the tangible things that can be lost, but the intangible things, especially the kingdom. There are a lot of peripheral ways in that religion helps as well. So, for example, just being part of a community, being here, for example, a group among you, and sort of having friends and having that support, and sort of if you're feeling down, that someone else can sort of be there for you. Even that can be a very strong thing. I would say that's a peripheral thing, because the central thing is indeed our relationship with Christ. Another thought is to remember something that I use in my rooms all the time, which is the serenity prayer. I'm sure you've all seen it in memes and things. God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So it makes a distinction between the things that are out of our control and the things that are in our control, and sometimes a discernment to know what might be in and out of our control. And the things that are out of our control, well, they might be out of our control, but they're certainly in God's control. And also to be able to have that mindfulness to sort of say that even though some things are out of my control, things are going to be okay. But not so much to be anxious about the things that are out of our control, because being anxious about them is not going to change anything, not to affect any positive change. And of course, Jesus talks about that when he talks about the birds in the air and the lilies of the field, and not to be anxious about those things, not to have, the Greek word is merimna in the scriptures. So to certainly have a mindfulness and an acceptance, that's the word that gets used in psychology circles, and an acceptance about those things that are out of our control, and then to things that are in our control, to be able to act on those things. So, for example, if our mood is might be low because of some stressor, well, that stressor might be out of our control, but there's things that I can do to help my mood. To be able to do a prayer, to be able to go for a walk, to eat healthily, to try and have good sleep habits, and the rest of it. Those things are in my control. And certainly the last bit is sort of in the wisdom to know the difference. Well, I guess part of the Orthodox mindset is indeed to have a spiritual father, and that can certainly guide us. And part of the discernment is one of the virtues that we sort of try and acquire through the spiritual life. So all those things, the psychologists have reinvented the wheel in some ways about the things that the church fathers talked about hundreds and hundreds of years ago. A lot of the cognitive work that the psychologists will do with the patients, sort of the Egyptian church fathers, not just the Egyptian fathers, but the Palestinian fathers, and later the Greek fathers in the desert, and the rest of it. They were the professors of sort of managing thoughts. And we know how powerful it is to be able to manage the thoughts. So, of course, those things go back hundreds and hundreds of years. You look at early church fathers, you look at Evagrius, you look at John Cassian, before him St. Anthony the Great, and so forth. A lot of the work that they did was in relation to thoughts. And, of course, in modern-day psychology, they sort of have stumbled across that, and sort of a lot of the work that a therapist will do is about dealing with thoughts.
Yeah, I think if I can add a personal comment to that, my training as a clinical psychologist was secular, and I came to this interest in the intersection between psychology and theology later in my career, and was amazed to find that the early church fathers talked about a lot of the things that I'd learned about in my master's training. I was amazed and surprised, but also just really delighted and really inspired by the fact that I suppose it was a discovery that our faith is so rich that all of those answers were already there, really. Yeah. Sorry.
And another way that sort of 100 years ago, people like Freud came and taught us about the subconscious, and then you look around 1,500 years prior to that, people like St. Macarius of Egypt talking about the heart and the different chambers in the heart, and there is the righteousness and there is unrighteousness, and Jesus wanting to be the throne in our heart. So the heart, you could say, we don't want to marry the two because they're two different ways of looking at things. So the way we look at the scientific versus the theology, we don't want to create one single combined area of interest. There are two different, distinct, the methodology is different. So we don't want to marry that because there's a danger in that. We can come back to that if needed. But we can learn from each other, from those. And there's overlapping concepts. So I think something like the subconscious being related to the heart, as Saint Macarius will talk about, is one example.
Yeah, and I think just to go back to what you were saying before that, Father George, was this idea of the role of how we engage with stresses. So, if you engage with a difficult period in your life, if your response to it is one of throwing up your hands in the air and going, oh, well, that's it then, everything's hopeless, it's all over. This is just another example of how everything goes wrong in my life. I'm a failure, I'm never going to be able to fix this. That sort of engagement with stress we know is not conducive to being resilient to it. Whereas what Father George was referring to earlier through the serenity prayer, which I love, is being able to recognize that there are some factors that we can control and that it's, God's given us the ability to do those things, and that the rest is about acceptance and putting ourselves and our situation in his hands. And so I think a lot of it comes down to how we approach what's happening to us and the perspective that we take on it. And the part of that perspective, a central part of that perspective, needs to be putting God in the center of it and really relying on our faith. And that, at the end of the day, is what's going to allow us to get through the trials that we face.
I think it's important to mention that just being religious does not automatically give you resilience, because sometimes we could have erroneous religious outlook. So, for example, if you believe that God is a punishing God or that God is punishing you, if there is a spiritual hopelessness, if there is excessive guilt, feeling abandoned by God, those things will not necessarily give you resilience. It is about that central faith that we have in our Lord Jesus Christ. And, so some of our adversity is a test of our faith. But the church gives us the tools as to how to build our faith. And of course, the scriptures being a big part of that.
Oh, there was so much there. There's a lot of really important insights. Maybe one thing we should make a bit clearer before we move on to take audience questions is the nature of the problem. So we've spoken about resilience as the sort of goal that we both spiritually and psychologically as something we want to be able to develop, because life is throwing, I suppose the word would be stressors, right? Things that cause us to need to be resilient. So maybe it would be worth asking, you're both practicing psychotherapists, you encounter a lot of people in stressful situations. What do you encounter the most? Like, what are the major stressors for people nowadays that cause us to need resilience?
I'm a child psychiatrist, so I deal with kids and teens. So the first word that comes to mind when you ask the question is the word bullying. What is bullying? Of course, people throw that around all the time. The specific definition of bullying is quite specific, sort of repeated, targeted, controlling behaviours, or behaviours that have that intend to harm or intimidate. Of course, it's different to being mean. I tell the kids that I see that, ask them a question: what proportion of kids will have some adverse experience by other peers? 20%, 30%, 50%. Well, the answer is close to 100%. We're all going to have these adverse experiences. And of course, there are things that make it harder to be able to manage those interactions. someone has autism, for example, they're going to sort of lack that flexibility that's required to sort of be resilient or be able to manage with the stress of being teased, for example. What might be happening at home, the strength of their, what we call attachment, their relationship with their parents and so forth. So that's on one level.
I think, Father, you see children and adolescents, and I see adults. So, ironically, bullying is also an issue for a lot of adults, particularly in the workplace. So, I suppose amongst adults, I would have to say work-related stress, relationship stress, very adverse events, chronic medical illnesses, mental health challenges. They would be, I think, the main ones that I probably would say. Trauma, particularly childhood trauma.
When we talk about resilience, my mind goes to, and it's a common in sort of, being second generation Greek Australian, for most of you, second, third generation, is our migrants. The migrants had enormous resilience. They came here with very, very little and very little support, and they just worked. And they were bullied. They were teased, they were discriminated against, they were called names and the rest of it. But you don't hear them talking about trauma in the sense that we talk about today. They experienced these adverse events, but yet it didn't traumatize them in the same way that we talk about trauma in modern day settings. And you've got to sort of look at, the faith is going to be one important aspect of how they were able to sort of make do. And I think there was also this collective, being able to overcome adversity, sort of leaning on each other and sort of modeling it for each other as well. To be able to not pay attention to a lot of the discrimination that was happening. Sure, they knew about it, they experienced it, they distressed them and things, but they just got on with life. So look, the stresses have existed. Perhaps there are factors, environmental factors and so forth, that cultural factors, which leads to those sort of negative experiences being a little bit more traumatic. But that's probably moved away from your question.
Well, no, it's very interesting though. I think it'll probably come back. Okay, I want to get now to, because there's a lot of questions coming in on the slider, but one final one for you both before we do that would be, because I think it will actually address some of these, but just in as sort of succinct a way as you can manage, what are the what's the easy 5-step program to developing resilience?
In my work, again, working with kids and teens, there is a very neat construct developed by a therapist in Sydney, Jan Worsley, talks about the resilience donut. The resilience donut, you can just imagine a donut. There's a hole in the middle, and in that middle, there's a circle there. It says the sense of self. What builds a sense of self? And she summarized it as I have, I am, I can. Abilities, identity, I am, identity, I have, resources, I can, abilities. So that sort forms a sense of self. And the donut around it is divided in various bits that relate to the strengths that this person has. And different people have different strengths. Some of those strengths include intelligence, include strong family relationships, include sociability, all sorts of things. These are the strengths that each child or each person can identify. And this author, Jan Worsley, the book is called The Secret of Strong Kids. If you Google it, you'll find it can buy it. I recommend it. It's very easy reading. It's nicely written, and the concept's very straightforward. General Worsley will say, you need a tripod of, just like you need a tripod for something to stand, like a camera, you put it on a tripod. You need, you can't have a bipod, it'll fall. So you need a tripod. A tripod is what keeps that stand up. Just like you need a tripod of legs for something to stand, our sense of self needs a tripod of strengths. So according to this model, it sort of encourages the family to identify what those, at least three, doesn't have to be three, can be more than three, those three strengths that the child possesses, and to build them up. And what I like about this model is that you're not looking at treating symptoms, treating mood symptoms, treating anxiety symptoms. You are strengthening the child, and the virtue of doing that helps to overcome the symptoms. So that's one neat model that I use. It's very useful. It is very empowering. Okay, what are your strengths? You're good at school. That's a strength. Excellent. What is your strength? You're good at sport. That's great. What is your strength? My parents have stable jobs, and we've got a functional family. That's an amazing strength. Okay, how can we strengthen those even more? And so that's one way of looking at the resilience model and how it applies in everyday sort of health.
Yeah, and I think, ironically, even though I know that Lynn developed that model mainly for work with children, it applies equally to adults. I think because I see people after that childhood period, they've not always had that experience of their strengths having been built adequately during their childhood. And so they come into adulthood not having a very strong sense of self, or a very strong sense of what they are good at and what makes them important as a person. And so often therapy is partly about that, apart from looking at helping them address the particular challenges that they might be facing. There's always an element that's about helping people work out what they're good at. And I don't even necessarily mean, that someone might be good at their job or be good at a particular skill. I mean, that's important. But often when people have had difficult lives and or challenges in adulthood, they have exhibited remarkable characteristics of patience and endurance and strength and the ability to keep going even when things are really difficult, and are still faithful and loyal to friends, and can still manage to keep down jobs and be there for their kids and try to have a good relationship. And so I think often reflecting on what people are able to do, the qualities that they bring to bear on the challenges that they face, can often give them a stronger sense of their strengths and who they are as a person.
That brings us very naturally to some of the questions that are coming in. So keep them coming in. I think we're also, if you feel brave and want to ask a question, just raise a hand and we'll slot you in. So I'm just trying to distill some of the essence of the questions that are coming in, because a lot of them are overlapping. And so one of the themes that I'm already noticing is as an example of a stressor that requires resilience that a lot of people experience is something like a failed relationship or a breakup. Maybe could you take that as a practical worked example of some of the stuff that we have been discussing so far? What does resilience look like in a situation like that?
I think it helps to have a sort of grounding in scriptural teaching and church teaching about relationships, and where relationships are in different stages of life. Because you all know that, in teenage years, relationships are extremely important. They start to have boyfriends and girlfriends and things. And those relationships can get extremely intense. Um, uh, and of course, if anything goes wrong, then it can affect the child's emotional being quite a lot. In my faith, I sort of feel that adolescence is not the time to be developing strong relationships. Sure, the society around us encourages that, but in our faith, we sort of know that there's not time for that. So I will often, whether the child is from a church background or whether they're just, I'm a psychiatrist, so I treat people, according to the medical model or the biopsychosocial model. And people come to me, most of them won't have a similar religious background. And I will say, look, could we perhaps focus on things that are more important in this stage of your life, like friendships, like trying to have good friendships, rather than having a boyfriend or girlfriend that can be extremely intense and hard to manage. And sometimes they'll like that idea, and sort of we focus on maintaining healthy friendships, rather than sort of the idea about, sort of having a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And then we sort of talk about sort of some of the pitfalls of those relationships and how they can very often in adolescence get out of hand. And of course, I'm not preaching them about what the gospel will say, but of course in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about church's teaching on purity and chastity, and how they are very helpful concepts. And whilst I might not preach about it, and I'll not mention those words, I will talk about, what might be healthy and what might be not healthy, what might be more age-related and what might not be age-related. Now, of course, in adulthood, it's sort of those relationships sort of take sort of the contextual factors are vastly different. But I don't know if you'd want to touch on that.
Relationship breakups are absolutely one of the biggest stresses that people can experience. Especially if it's a long-term relationship, and especially if there was a hope or an expectation that it was going to lead to marriage. That is, extremely difficult. And of course, even more difficult if it is in the context of the breakup of a marriage. In terms of resilience to that, I think if it's about a relationship that's broken up before marriage, which obviously happens a lot, I think what I would encourage people to keep in mind is that relationships take work. They don't just happen, and they are and being in a relationship successfully and effectively is actually a skill that not many of us are really just born with, and that we're not really taught. We're not really taught how to be a good partner. It's not, there's no class at school that teaches you these things, and there's no subject in the HSC that teaches you these things. We all kind of learn these things as we go. And sometimes we get them horribly wrong, and sometimes the relationship was just not part of God's plan for us in the first place. And so I think, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about making meaning of what's happened, that if you can put it in the context of I suppose God's greater plan for your life, and see it as a learning experience, and see it as a bump in the road towards something bigger and better and more beautiful and more perfect that God has in store for you, then I think that can go a long way. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't mean that it's not difficult. But I think that's the whole point about resilience, that we're talking about adapting and coping with things that are really difficult and that really do hurt. But we, if we can keep all of those factors in mind, I think it helps.
The other thing is that as as Orthodox Christians, we are encouraged to work on ourselves. So rather than externalize blame, and of course we will be hurt, and we're not saying that we minimize or suppress the feeling of being hurt. It's being able to be able to manage it, to be able to deal with it, to be able to sort of grow from it. But part of our journey of self-cultivation is to be always learning about ourselves. The ancient Greeks used to say the most important thing is the knowledge of ourselves, the gnosis avton. To be able to sort of even reflect on, did I do something that may have stressed this relationship? And that helps us to, goes back to, what we said about the serenity prayer. There are things that are out of our control, things that are in our control. And if I can use this as an opportunity to get to know myself better and to be able to grow in virtue, to recognize that not all is lost because life goes on, and God has a plan for me and God still loves me, then those things are there to for us to be able to overcome and to grow through those things and to become better for those things rather than to sort of struggle to move on.
I was going to add to that was that I think one of the ways of thinking about that situation that often get people stuck is comparing their situation to others. So it may feel like everyone around you is in a great relationship and headed in the right direction, and that you're the only one in this particular position. I think it always, as Father George just said, if you focus on yourself and knowing what that means for what you need to work on to be better in a relationship, then you can recognize, I think, more clearly that it's not about what everyone else is doing, that we're all on our own path and our own journey, and that God's timeframes for us might be different to his timeframes for the people around us, and that's completely okay.
Feels like what you said earlier, Margaret, about narratives and the role that our faith plays in being able to make meaning. I mean, that feels really important here, because I wonder if, I get the sense that one of the things that can be so devastating, it ties in what you're saying about comparison, about relationship breakups, is the narrative that we think it tells about ourselves. And then also I wonder if are there also sort of cultural narratives that feed into that comparison, where there's a sense of things are supposed to happen a certain way, and then when they don't, there's a sense that my narrative has somehow totally gone off the rails.
Yeah, I think culturally there's obviously a lot of pressure, and it doesn't help that every time you go to a wedding, all of everyone says, "Oh, badly," here we go. You're next, or may you be next. So there's that whole sort of cultural thing of where we're going to be. Where you feel like you must be doing something wrong, or as you pointed out, Sam, there must be something wrong with me, perhaps, because everyone else seems to be doing this and I can't. And so, yeah, I think being very mindful of what you're saying to yourself, of the narrative that you are building about that, the story that you're telling yourself about it. And looking at it from the perspective of God's plan for you instead, and what can you do to work on yourself in the meantime, I think can be really helpful.
Jesus says something quite profound in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Seek first the kingdom of heaven and everything else will be added to you." And this is great to help put us things in perspective. What's my life consisting of? What's the most important thing in my life? And I think we can say that the most important thing in our life is Christ and our salvation. And Christ gives a promise here. It's an ironclad promise. Seek first the kingdom of heaven and all those other things will be added to you. What is all those other things? and I'm speaking as a confessor here, that the experience of the church is that if we trust God, then He will take care of even those things. But we need to trust God, and we need to allow God to act in His own time in the best benefit for us, and not be impatient in what things to be done according to how we want them to be done. And Christ says, if you want to follow me, whoever wants to follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Is you're surrendering your will to God and asking God to take over. Now, some people struggle with that because they sort of feel that it becomes very passive. But it's not necessarily the case, because our faith in God, and that goes back to what we said before about hope, that indeed God is real and God wants the best for me. And therefore, my job is to try and have that devotion to Him. And for things that are out of our control, I trust that He will take care of those things. And if things don't go according to how I think or society thinks they should go, that's okay.
There's a few questions as well to do with resilience in a church or a service setting, and particularly feelings of sort of trauma or bad associations people have if they have bad experiences at church, or especially with clergy, or something where their sort of whole experience of church then becomes sort of poisoned. Do you have any thoughts on what resilience looks like in situations like that, if someone feels hurt or let down by the church or the clergy?
Right. The first thing to say is that God could have chosen angels to take the role of the clergy, but He doesn't. He could have had angels to take the role of the board and the ladies' auxiliary and the youth leaders and this and that, but He doesn't. We are all members of the church. You know that Christ is perfect, He is the head, and we are the body. And we are saved through each other. No one's an island. No one can be saved on their own. We're all saved through each other. And part of it is how we deal with these adversities. Of course, we try not to be the cause of scandal to anybody. And of course, Jesus says some quite strong words about that. He says it'd be better if a millstone went around your neck rather than you scandalize people. Scandalize sort of being a stumbling block to their faith. Cause trauma, if you like. But no one's perfect. And it's how we deal with each other's perfection that helps each other grow. We see some, there might be some bad apples in clergy, and the rest of it, again, clergy are still humans. But we see lots of amazing examples. Now, if we get scandalized by the bad example and we are not inspired by the good example, that might say something about the way we look at things. I think if we have a balanced view and expectations of each other, I think that helps us, if we are traumatized, distressed, scandalized by each other's behavior, hopefully there's enough good examples to keep our faith strong. That's just one thought.
I think that's a really good point. That if one's focus is only on the negatives, then that says something about one's perspective. And I like what you said, Father, about that we're all in it with our own imperfections, and that we can learn from each other's imperfections together, because none of us can be saved alone. I think that we're all in it together. We're all on that same journey, whether we're a layperson or clergy. And so how we engage with each other in the context of all those imperfections, I think, is important.
There are also a few questions about the relationship between faith and resilience and dealing with anxiety. So sort of, I mean, one of them, for example, like how do we tell the difference between weakness of faith versus lack of resilience? Are the two the same thing? Are they earlier? But
I think we need to qualify the whole discussion that we've had today to sort of say that some of us may have experiences with quite severe symptoms of mental illness, depression, anxiety, so forth. That is not necessarily a lack of faith. We talk about the things that can strengthen us, things that we can use. But we also recognize that some of us are vulnerable to particular conditions, whether they be psychiatric conditions, whether they can be medical conditions or other types of conditions. So I think it's important that we approach this with a non-judgmental mind, either about ourselves or others. And I don't want anyone to leave here to sort of say, I've had anxiety, therefore I have a lack of faith. That is not what we're saying. Yeah?
Absolutely, that's not what we're saying. Yep, thank you for making that point.
So we know that faith can help. We've got no doubt, unqualified faith can help. So that's the first point, and then I realise I've lost track of your question. Take over.
Thank you for making that point, because I think that sorry, my voice is suddenly going. Because I think that culturally we sometimes will say, have faith, and if you have faith, then you won't get depressed or anxious. But I think I think we both agree that that's not the way that we look at it at all.
We also have examples of saints that really struggled with their mental health. We have had saints that have had existential crises, that felt the abandonment of God, and that's sort of quite well described. One of the saints I like to talk about is a saint in the Greek Orthodox Church. He lived in the 18th century, Saint Paisios Basias. He had most likely bipolar disorder. So at particular times he was sort of very functional and he did miracles and things, and at other times he would sort of withdraw and he's had aberrant behaviour. Now that is different from a group of aberrant behaviour we call the Fools for Christ. That's a different topic altogether. It was likely that his behaviour was not as a result of sort of being a fool for Christ, but the saints were not immune from some of these things. Maybe it was just a test from God, that they felt the abandonment of God, for example, or whatever the case is. The church fathers had a very clear categorization of what causes aberrations in emotions or behavior. There is a very good book by Jean-Claude Lachey that the categorization is insanity due to somatic complaints, and they certainly had particular somatic conditions that gave rise to aberrant behaviors. There's a sort of clear demarcation of that. There is insanity of demonic causes, and we haven't touched on that today, and that's a different topic in itself. And there's insanity because of spiritual illness. Things such as sadness, lipi, akidia, which is the various passions that we all have that are related to aberrations in emotions, behavior. All those things are very precisely diagnosed by the church fathers. Going back to your question, it's about sort of trying to have the balance. Our discussion today and both of us are very strong proponents of that, is that, we don't just deal with this in a spiritual way. Sometimes we need to get secular help, psychologist, therapist, a psychiatrist, and we work in that field, and we work across the different paradigms. And we just need to be flexible and open and recognize that these infirmities are just part of the fallen human condition that God has allowed.
Audience question.
Just going back on that question, I just want to put that question in a different way. How can I tell if my anxiety and overthinking are spiritual warfare, needing prayer and fasting, or just a psychological issue needing help? How can I tell if my anxiety and overthinking are spiritual warfare, needing prayer and fasting, or just a psychological issue needing professional help?
I think that's a very, very good question. And I can't pretend to be an expert on discerning spiritual versus psychological. So I may need to defer to Father George on this to some degree. But but one way that I think about it, and that I am learning to think about it from people who are much more experienced and knowledgeable at these things than I am, is whether the voice is the way God would speak to you, if that makes sense. So if the voice that you're hearing sounds like the kind of voice that would be coming from our very loving, merciful, giving Lord, that's one thing. But if it is one that engenders hopelessness, despair, is excessively harsh on you, is not one that is likely to lead to you being able to keep going and persisting and struggling ascetically, which we're all called to do, then that is, my understanding is that's one way of being able to distinguish. But I would also say that you must consult the advice of your spiritual father, because you need that discernment that he can provide. Can you add to that, Father George?
Certainly, and your last point about the spiritual father, I think, is the most important, that he can provide a spiritually sound external perspective that might help to clarify that. If there are some saints, modern saints, who are a little bit dismissive of psychiatry, psychology, because on the whole, the secular practices tend to dismiss God. I get a lot of people that come to me and they say, I've been told I need to see a psychiatrist, and can I see you, please? Most of the time I'll have to advise, sorry, I can't, books are closed, I only see kids. But I also advise them that 95% of the time, if you see a spiritual father and you see a psychologist, the two will both be quite helpful. In the psychologist, not all priests have the discernment and the holiness of the saints to be able to provide this sort of healing like the saints could have. And therefore we rely on secular techniques. And most of the time there's nothing wrong with that. And then your spiritual father providing some guidance. I think there's a complementarity in the approach which is often quite helpful. And I would probably say, yes, For people of faith, then the spiritual father is going to be extremely important. And the reason I say for people of faith, because it's not something you can impose on someone that, may not have that conviction of faith. So we, allow people to exercise their free will. So if the symptoms feel like depression or anxiety, then the therapist is going to be extremely helpful. If there's anything that you're not sure about, you can always check in with your spiritual father. Trying to work on the spiritual life will help. So it becomes a mutually beneficial thing. Medications will sometimes be required. And there's no shame in that. Just like most people will not have an issue with taking puffers for their asthma and needles for their diabetes and this and that. In some ways, not always, in some ways, taking medications for their mental health is part of the condition and their treatment. So how do we know? One answer is to work on your spiritual life and, if required, have a psychologist, GP, psychiatrist to sort of help with some of the medical aspects relating to mental health. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Father. Earlier you mentioned, the verse about seek first the kingdom of heaven and all these things shall be added to you. Do you see a danger for religious people when they're very faithful in their religion and life's not aligning with them to further reinforce the notion that God is displeased with them or he doesn't like them? Because so many people, they see other people in the world more successful than they are, although they do the right things and they go to church and so forth. Do you think that could further reinforce the idea that God doesn't like me or life's not fair and that narrative?
There's always a danger. It goes back to what we said before about thoughts. There's actually a book, I think in the Serbian Orthodox tradition, our thoughts determine our lives. And St. Paisios in the Greek Orthodox tradition talks about how important the thoughts are and being able to manage thoughts. So yes, what you're talking about, you're sort of talking about, you're sort of making mention of what we call cognitive distortions. All or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, emotive thinking, and the rest of it. And yes, I did mention before that some it's more than just being religious, because yes, you can have these maladaptive thinking, even and intertwine your faith into that. And that can be, some people get very stuck with that. There's no doubt. And I think, again, spiritual father can be very helpful to sort of guide that sort of stuckness in some of that thoughts. But you can take any verse from the Bible and you can adapt some maladaptive thought or some cognitive distortion, and it will harm you rather than help you. Which is why we never take quotes out of context. We always see it as part of the great message of the scriptures, which is a message of hope. I'm not sure how that speaks to your question, though.
I think so. Is the distortion in this case is that, well, there's this promise that if I seek the kingdom of God first, then my marriage and my finances and everything will, all those things will be added to me. And then there's a worry that, well, if that doesn't happen exactly to the letter, then I'll feel let down by God. Is that an example of the all or nothing?
The question is, what is most important in my life in terms of, all these things will be added to you. Well, okay. You might say that health will be added to me, and yet I get cancer, right? Has God abandoned me? The answer is not necessarily no. No, God has not abandoned you because you've got cancer. In actual fact, there was a conversation, St. Paisios and someone said, well, are we going to find the cure for cancer? And he said, well, it's under the doctor's noses, but God will not reveal to them because through cancer, the gates of heaven have been opened. In other words, the adversity that people face, and they're able to, if you're healthy and you disregard God, but yet you find God through your illness, which is very common, then that illness becomes a benefit and becomes salvific. So what's required here is a little bit of flexibility of thought and that trust in God. And it goes back to what we said. We expect things to go in a particular way. When God says, seek the kingdom of heaven and everything else will be added to you, in the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about the basic necessities. The God will provide. He is not guaranteeing that things will go well according to how you perceive them to go well. But if we have a model of just saying that if God's allowed it, he's allowed it for my good, and I'm going to be patient through it, and I'm going to sort of, that sort of approach adversity in a godly way, then, I put my trust in God. So, it's about having that flexibility of thought, having that sort of trust in God, and having a sort of a mindset of salvific mindset rather than focusing on the material things of this life.
Thank you both so much. There's obviously a lot more that we could talk about. Would either of you like to say anything to conclude? Maybe Margaret, do you want to say something quickly about the counselling?
Yeah, absolutely. As Sam mentioned earlier, St. Cyril's is at a very exciting kind of juncture. Starting from semester 2, we're introducing a suite of counselling degrees in which we're basically aiming to offer professionally accredited counselling degrees, so at graduate certificate, graduate diploma and master's level, that for pastoral ministry, so counselling in the context of pastoral ministry, both for clergy and for lay servants. And so if you are a servant who has sometimes thought that you might benefit, that your service might benefit from having some basic psychological knowledge and some basic sort of counselling skills under your belt, then these degrees basically are for you. That's why we're offering them. So they start semester 2 this year, which is end of July. And we're really very, very excited about what we are sort of embarking on at the college, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone who might be interested to give you some more information. Yeah. Yeah, so if you wanted to, then you can use these degrees professionally. So they're accredited with the Australian Counselling Association as a professional qualification in the counselling field. So you could get a job and work as a counsellor if you wanted to. But our focus of the degrees really is, in addition to offering the degrees to people who want to use the degrees for professional purposes, career purposes, is really to equip people in our community for pastoral ministry. I think there's a real need for that in our community, and so we're hoping that what that will mean is that we end up with a whole new generation of counsellors in our community who can help meet the mental health and sort of related needs, both within our community and outside it, of course, as well. So it's not just about serving our community. I think it's also worth saying that the units are all going to be very embedded from a theological perspective. So if you like the approach that Father George and I have tried to take today of looking at things both from that sort of scientific, psychological / psychiatric perspective as well as from an orthodox theological perspective, that's the way that we'll be running the degrees. So all the units will be taking that perspective. And in fact, there'll be 2 foundational theology units that kick off the counselling degrees to ensure that all students have the right theological sort of foundations going into the counselling units themselves.
So yeah, if this sort of thing does interest you, make sure you pull Margaret aside. It's something we're very excited about at St. Cyril's because it can be of great service to our church communities and more broadly moving forward. So thank you all for your attention. We'll conclude with a prayer led by Father George.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. God bless you in your work.
Just some quick announcements. The next PKF meeting will be in 2 weeks' time with Father Andrew again and the Holy Apostles. So we'll see you guys again in 2 weeks. Food and fellowship is outside. We are renovating the Arabic church, so get those muscles working, whoever can help. And I think that's everything.